A group of aggressive bikers surrounded a young black student in the middle of the park, their mocking smiles revealing an air of dominance. They were used to bullying the weak, accustomed to seeing fear in others' eyes, and accustomed to no one daring to stand up against them. But today, they had made a mistake. He wasn't their prey. He was the son of a Navy SEAL captain, trained to remain calm, plan every move, and take down his opponents in an instant. They struck first, but when he retaliated, they immediately regretted it. Sitting alone on a park bench, Jaden Carter flipped through the pages of the book in his hand, but his mind wasn't fully absorbed in the words. He was waiting for his younger brother, Jordan Carter, to finish his game. His school uniform was still on, white shirt, khaki pants, and slightly dusty gray sneakers after a long day. His backpack hung lopsidedly from one shoulder, and he didn't look like someone about to step into a dangerous evening. Jaden wasn't the type of person to seek trouble. He wasn't particularly social, but he wasn't isolated either. At school, his peers respected him for his calm demeanor and the way he always kept his cool in every situation. He had something that very few 15-year-olds had: discipline. His father, Richard Carter, was a Navy SEAL captain, a strict man who also showed great love. He not only trained elite soldiers, but also trained his own son from an early age. He taught Jaden how to observe, how to read situations, how to control his breath, how to react at the right moment, and how to defend himself if necessary. To him, the outside world wasn't all good. It was full of dangers, and Jaden needed to be ready for anything. Jaden still remembered his father's words. When danger comes, you have two choices: run or face it. If you choose to face it, make sure you're prepared. Growing up under that strict guidance, Jaden was no ordinary high school student. He understood tactics, self-control, and most importantly, he knew that strength didn't always lie in muscles. It lay in the mind and discipline. He glanced over toward the soccer field. Jordan's game seemed to be nearing its end. Another ordinary day, nothing special. No one could have predicted that just minutes later, all this calm would be shattered. The final whistle blew from the field, followed by cheers from the kids and applause from the parents. Jaden slightly raised his head, looking toward Jordan, who was happily running toward his teammates, exchanging high fives after the game. He was about to stand up and call his brother when another sound, sharp and menacing, shattered the peace of the park. The roar of motorcycle engines, thunderous like a pack of wild beasts encroaching on another's territory, made the atmosphere suddenly tense. Unlike the usual motorcycle groups that passed through Fairfield every evening, these people weren't planning to keep going. They stopped just near the park entrance, forming an immobile barrier, their bikes lined up in a straight row, blocking a wide gap. 5 men, all wearing black leather jackets, faded jeans, and heavy boots, sat on their motorcycles with cold, sharp eyes scanning the park as if looking for something. They didn't talk, didn't laugh, only watched silently with a chilling patience. Jaden immediately felt a discomfort creeping into him, a gut instinct warning him to look up more closely. The leader sat on a massive Harley-Davidson, a tough man with a buzz cut and a scruffy beard, his muscular arms covered in tattoos that looked like remnants of a past full of wrongdoing. His eyes gleamed with a coldness that Jaden had seen before in the faces of his father's fellow soldiers. But here, it wasn't protective. It was threatening. He slowly took off his gloves, placed both hands on his knees, and then nodded slightly to the man sitting beside him. This man was shorter but had broad shoulders and hands like clamps. He nodded, grinning, and turned toward another biker, whispering something Jaden couldn't hear. But Jaden could feel something wasn't right. In a few brief seconds, all 5 men's eyes locked onto Jaden, as though they had found what they were searching for. A chill ran down his spine. Jaden never liked to think negatively, but his instincts, honed through his father's training, were screaming at him. These people weren't here by chance, and the way they were looking at him wasn't curiosity, it was targeting. Without rushing, Jaden carefully glanced around. The park was still full of people. Kids were still playing, parents were chatting, a few elderly people were walking along the gravel path. No one seemed to notice the bikers or feel the tension quietly building. These people had chosen the perfect moment, when the crowd's attention was distracted, when most people wouldn't notice something unusual, like hunters who knew how to strike when their prey was unaware. Jaden gripped his book tighter, took a deep breath. He wasn't the type to panic easily, but this wasn't just a group of harmless strangers. The way they were watching him, the way they exchanged looks, the way they had stopped and deliberately blocked the path, all of it had a clear purpose. He didn't know what they wanted, but he was sure this wasn't a coincidence. Something was about to happen, and Jaden needed to be ready. Jaden didn't move at all, but every one of his senses was taut like a bowstring. From an outsider's perspective, he was just a teenager sitting on a stone bench, quietly reading a book in the peaceful afternoon. But Jaden knew the situation was far more complicated than that. He could sense the deliberate movement from the biker gang in front of him, not hurried, not loud, but full of calculation. The bald guy, over 6 feet tall, with muscles like a street fighter, was the first to get off his bike. He walked slowly, each step he took crunching heavily on the gravel, as if to make sure Jaden knew he was approaching. Behind him were 2 others, one skinny but with eyes sharp as knives, and the other shorter, with broad shoulders like a bull, his arms covered in bizarre tattoos. Jaden could feel their movements had purpose, like wolves slowly surrounding their prey, not rushing to attack, but not leaving any escape routes either. He didn't turn and run, nor did he stand to confront them. Instead, he calmly turned a page in his book, pretending not to notice them, though his heart was beating faster than usual. A deep, mocking voice came from just above his head. "What are you doing here, kid?" Jaden looked up slightly, his eyes locking with the cold gray eyes of the bald man. Despite the arrogant stance, the look in his eyes said he wasn't just a street bully. This was the type of person who was used to dominating others, accustomed to the fear he instilled. Jaden wasn't flustered, nor did he look away. He replied calmly, "Waiting for my brother." The confidence in his voice made the bald man raise an eyebrow, as though not expecting a high school kid to remain so composed. One of the other 2 men smirked, but said nothing. The bald man tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning Jaden's school uniform, then sneered, "This place isn't for people like you." Jaden felt the danger in those words, not just an insult, but a veiled threat. People like you. That phrase wasn't just about discrimination, but implied that he didn't belong here, that he was crossing a line that the bald man had drawn. Jaden tightened his grip on the book, but didn't let any discomfort show on his face. He had heard his father say that those who like to threaten are always looking for a reaction. If you're afraid, they'll overpower you. If you get angry, they'll provoke you into a fight. Instead, Jaden kept his tone steady, neither high nor low, neither trembling nor challenging. This is a public park. A short silence stretched between them. The air suddenly felt unusually heavy, as if even the surrounding sounds had been absorbed into the tense space between Jaden and the bikers. The bald man squinted, no longer mocking. He hadn't expected this response. He had expected Jaden to stutter, bow his head, or simply leave in silence, but that didn't happen. The 2 men on either side began to move slightly, silently, forming a subtler, tighter encirclement. They weren't in a rush, but each small step pushed Jaden closer to the gap between the bench and the oak tree behind him. They weren't just trying to intimidate, they were trying to control. "You seem smart, kid." The bald man clicked his tongue, a thin smile flickering on his lips. "But sometimes being too smart isn't a good thing." Jaden didn't answer immediately, but he noticed a shift in how they were acting. This wasn't just a usual threat anymore. It was a psychological test. They were trying to see how he would react, whether he would panic or stand firm. He took a deep breath, quietly analyzing the situation. He was at a disadvantage, alone, facing 3 larger men, with limited space to move, and although there were people around, no one was paying attention to what was happening. He could clearly see the small details on their faces, every shift in their movements, every subtle change in their tone and posture. His father had taught him how to read the enemy, and right now, that lesson was becoming his strongest weapon. Jaden didn't show fear, but he knew this situation couldn't last much longer. One wrong move, and everything could spiral out of control. The tension between Jaden and the biker gang hadn't subsided. On the contrary, it was tightening like an invisible rope. He could feel it in the way the 3 men moved around him, the way they exchanged glances, and especially the cold, sharp stare from the bald one, who clearly wasn't pleased that Jaden wasn't showing the fear he had expected. Jaden remained seated, back straight, hands comfortably resting on his knees, but he was ready. If necessary, he could react immediately, but he knew that confronting them right now wasn't the best course of action. He needed to observe more, to understand what they truly wanted before making a decision. Then, a familiar but faint voice called out from a distance, pulling Jaden's attention away from his thoughts. "Jaden!" Jordan sprinted across the grass, sweat still dripping from his forehead, his short curly hair damp from the game. The boy's face was lit up with a bright smile, clearly unaware of the situation his brother was in. To Jordan, the park was still a safe, carefree place, free from the shadow of lurking danger. A chill ran through Jaden, but he maintained his calm exterior. He didn't want his younger brother to panic, but the bikers weren't so composed. As soon as Jordan got closer, one of the bikers, the thin one with eyes sharp as knives, suddenly burst into laughter, then pointed a finger at Jordan, like a predator who had just spotted an easier prey to take down. "Is this your little brother?" he sneered, his voice laced with amusement, but tinged with a clear malice. Jordan froze in his tracks, his gaze darting from Jaden to the strangers. The boy didn't understand what was happening, but even a child's instincts could sense when something was off. The innocent smile faded from Jordan's face, replaced by a hint of confusion and caution. The biker leaned forward, hands stuffed into his leather jacket pockets, sneering. "Maybe we should teach both of you a lesson." Jaden no longer remained still. In a split second he stood up, his movement slow but powerful, like a taut string about to snap. He didn't advance, but his gaze changed. Not calm and indifferent anymore, but colder, sharper, more alert. Jordan might not understand what was happening, but Jaden knew this was a critical turning point. This was no longer a random threat or a meaningless intimidation. These men were pushing things to another level. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to appear aggressive, but when he spoke his voice was deep, slow, and firm, like a final warning. "Don't touch him." The air seemed to freeze for a moment. The bald biker squinted, as if reassessing the situation. He stopped laughing, but he didn't back down. The way Jaden stood there, unshaken, unyielding, and not showing weakness was clearly not what he had expected. A 15-year-old boy standing up to 3 grown men, he should have been afraid, should have bowed his head, should have stammered an apology. But Jaden didn't. The silence stretched on, taut like a thread that could snap at any moment. The thin biker glanced at the bald one, as if seeking approval for what to do next. The shorter, broader one shifted slightly, as if preparing for something. Jaden felt the sweat on his palms, but he didn't move. Any motion now could make things worse. Jordan stared at his brother, not understanding why Jaden was reacting this way, but instinctively stayed silent, not saying a word. In Jaden's mind, a whirlwind of thoughts flashed by like a storm. I'm outnumbered and outpowered. But I have an advantage. I've been trained to stay calm, to control my breathing, to assess the situation. They haven't acted yet, which means they're still testing me. If I show fear or react incorrectly, they'll push further. But if I show them I'm not easy to bully, things might change. Jaden clenched his fists, took a deep breath, and slowly lowered his shoulders, holding his position, ready for whatever would come next. But one thing was certain. They had made a big mistake by targeting his little brother. The atmosphere in the park was usually calm and peaceful, but right under the old oak tree, an invisible storm was slowly forming. Jaden could feel the tension tightening around him, like a guitar string stretched to its limit, ready to snap with the slightest trigger. The group of bikers stood around him, like predators who had just spotted an intriguing prey. Their laughter echoed, soft, but enough for Jaden to sense that this was not ordinary amusement. It carried mockery, a challenge, and most importantly, a certainty that he would fall before their strength. "Did you hear what he said? Don't touch him," one of them sneered. The skinny guy with sharp eyes was the first to speak, grinning as though he'd just heard the best joke of the day. His voice was gravelly, dragging out each word as if teasing Jaden. Jaden didn't reply. His eyes briefly flicked over him, then returned to the bald man, clearly the leader of the group. "Well, that sounds pretty tough, kid. Who do you think you are, a superhero or some kind of tough fighter?" The short, broad-shouldered man shook his head with a mocking smile, but Jaden noticed something. He wasn't laughing as loudly as before. Instead, he was watching him carefully, like a tiger assessing whether its prey was worth attacking. The bald man didn't laugh. He stood there, one large hand resting on his hip, his muscular arm covered in tattoos running from shoulder to wrist, sharp lines marking a past story he'd never tell. His gaze was locked onto Jaden, eyes as sharp as knives, analyzing every tiny movement Jaden made. He took a step forward. Just one step, but it was enough to create an invisible pressure, as if he'd shortened the distance between them to test Jaden's reaction. "You're stubborn, kid." His voice was deep, not rushed, but carrying a threat. "Let's see if you can still talk tough." Then, suddenly, he lunged forward, shoving hard at Jaden. For an ordinary person, this push would throw them off balance, possibly making them stumble back or at least wobble. But Jaden was no ordinary person. He had been trained. His father had taught him how to read the movements of an enemy, how to handle situations where balance was lost, how to turn a weak position into strength. Jaden didn't immediately dodge. That was the first lesson his father had taught him. Most people, when attacked suddenly, would instinctively jump back or flinch, but that's exactly what the opponent wanted, a sign of panic. If Jaden had retreated now, the bald man would have kept closing in, pushing forward until there was no space left to avoid him. Instead, Jaden waited for the exact moment when the bald man's hand was almost upon his chest. Then he shifted his body to the right at just the right time, turning his hips and arms so that the bald man's hand slid harmlessly past him without touching the critical spot. At the same time, he grabbed the man's wrist, tightening his grip and twisting it slightly at a 45-degree angle. a wrist control technique his father had taught him. The bald man froze. His confidence, his dominating attitude was shattered in an instant as pain shot from his wrist up his arm. He didn't fall, he didn't scream, but Jaden saw how quickly he pulled his hand back. His eyes colder now, no longer filled with the arrogance they once held. That moment had shifted the balance. The skinny biker stopped laughing immediately, and the broad-shouldered man raised an eyebrow, his eyes flickering with a hint of caution that had not been there before. They no longer saw Jaden as a weak kid. That simple wrist grab wasn't just a counterattack, it was a message. A clear warning that Jaden wasn't easy prey, that he knew how to defend himself, and that they had misjudged him. Jaden took a deep breath, remaining calm, not letting the adrenaline cloud his judgment. He had stopped their first move, but he knew this wasn't over. The bald man didn't retreat. He frowned, gripping his twisted wrist tightly, then slowly lowered his hand to his hip. There were no angry shouts, no looks of seething hatred, just a heavy silence. He had just realized one thing. The kid in front of him wasn't going to be bullied. But that didn't mean he would give up. The skinny biker glanced at the broad-shouldered man, as if signaling him to get ready. Jordan stood behind Jaden, his eyes filled with worry. He didn't speak, but his small hand gripped the edge of Jaden's shirt as if looking for some kind of anchor. Jaden knew he couldn't let things go any further. But he also knew something else. This was no longer a game. This moment had changed everything. Jaden clenched his fist lightly, lowering his center of gravity, ready for whatever came next. The bikers were ready too. The invisible tension was about to snap, and Jaden knew, just one more second, and the storm would hit. A moment of stillness enveloped the space. The bald man stood there, silent, unmoving at first, but his gaze had changed. No longer was there arrogance or contempt in his eyes. He was reassessing Jaden, like a predator realizing its prey is not as weak as it first appeared. Jaden kept his eyes fixed on the man, but he knew full well that violence tends to escalate, and this situation was slipping beyond control. He could sense the shift on both sides. The two remaining bikers were ready to act, and this time they wouldn't stop at threats. They had decided to use force. In the blink of an eye, they rushed forward. The short, broad-shouldered biker was the first to strike. He sprang off the ground with force, launching a punch directly at Jaden's face, a strike with no mercy. Jaden saw it coming immediately. The punch was strong but too obvious. It came from too far away, and as soon as the biker's shoulder moved forward, Jaden felt the direction of the punch. He didn't retreat. Instead, he lowered himself just before the fist could reach his chin. The wind whistled overhead as the punch missed by mere centimeters, but before the biker could retract his arm, Jaden countered. He turned quickly, like a flowing river, sweeping his leg behind the biker's planted foot, then pushing one of his shoulders forward. The biker lost his balance immediately. He couldn't resist the force of gravity as his body was pulled by Jaden's movement. He crashed to the ground, his back slamming into the park surface. A sharp breath escaped his throat as the fall stunned him for a moment. But Jaden had no time to celebrate. Just as the first biker hit the ground, another came charging from behind, faster and more dangerous. He swung a powerful punch from the right, far stronger than the first one. But Jaden had already anticipated it. He spun to the left, dodging the punch by a hair's breadth, feeling the imbalance in his opponent's motion. This was the moment he needed. Jaden didn't give him time to retract his arm. As the biker's body tilted from the missed punch, Jaden delivered a sideways kick to his ribs, the heel of his foot striking hard enough to send the biker stumbling back 3 steps. He gasped for air, clutching his side, clearly not expecting a 15-year-old to hit that hard. Jaden stood firm, his feet planted solidly on the ground, his breath steady, but his eyes sharper than ever. 2 bikers had been quickly taken down, but Jaden knew the most dangerous one hadn't yet moved. He had only 2 seconds to recognize the change in the bald man's face. The cold, calm demeanor was gone. The mockery was no more. Instead, pure rage ignited in his eyes, a silent but deadly fury, like a hunter who had been wounded by his prey. He didn't yell or roar, he simply took a step forward and charged, and Jaden knew this attack would be stronger than anything he'd faced before. He wasn't fighting like a street thug. He charged like an out-of-control truck, both hands raised to unleash a straight punch, unadorned, uncomplicated, but full of power. If the blow landed, Jaden knew he'd be taken down instantly, but Jaden was ready. He didn't meet the punch head-on, he couldn't. The difference in size was too great, and even though he had been trained, Jaden knew he couldn't match raw strength against a man like the bald one. So he did the opposite. The moment the bald man closed in on the danger zone, Jaden didn't step back. Instead, he shifted his weight to the right, leaning away just in time to evade the punch. As the man's arm swung through the air, Jaden moved instantly. He spun around, driving his elbow sharply into the biker's side. He halted immediately. The strike wasn't enough to take him down, but it was enough to make him stagger back a step, his eyes widening in surprise at the sudden pain. Jaden didn't give him a chance to retaliate. As the man struggled to regain his balance, Jaden spun once more, this time delivering a kick straight to his knee, a move his father had taught him, targeting a weakness in the opponent's balance. The bald man buckled to one knee. Jaden remained steady, his gaze void of satisfaction or arrogance, only absolute focus. He knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time since the bikers appeared, Jaden was no longer the prey. Now, he was the one controlling the game. Jaden's final kick struck directly into the bald man's knee, causing him to stumble, one leg buckling to the ground as a sharp breath left his chest in pain that spread throughout his body. This was the first time someone, especially a 15-year-old kid, had forced him into a defensive stance. But Jaden didn't attack immediately. He held his position, watching every movement of the bald man, waiting for his next move. The skinny biker and the broad-shouldered man had been temporarily taken out, but the bald man was different. He wasn't panicking, nor had he lost control. Instead, he lowered his body, took a deep breath, and slowly stood up. Jaden noticed a change in his eyes. No longer was there just anger, no more mocking. Instead, it was the look of someone who had just realized they had misjudged their opponent. And this time, he wasn't going to make the same mistake again. He started to move differently, not charging recklessly, but stepping more cautiously, more assuredly, like a real fighter preparing for a serious match. Jaden furrowed his brow. He had hoped that the kick to the knee would make him hesitate, but instead, it had only made him more cautious. He was beginning to fight seriously. Jaden knew he couldn't face him head-on. He was stronger, heavier, and more experienced in fighting. But that didn't mean he couldn't win. He couldn't win through sheer strength. But he could win with intellect. Jaden started to move, never staying in one spot. For someone as large as the bald man, speed was his greatest enemy. The bald man observed Jaden's movements, then suddenly threw a punch with his right hand, a powerful blow. But Jaden was ready. He dodged to the right, feeling the gust of wind as the punch narrowly missed his chin. But instead of just dodging, Jaden immediately countered. He grabbed his wrist, locking it tightly with both hands, and spun. using all his body weight to pull him forward. The bald man lost his balance, and in that moment, Jaden lowered his body, sweeping his right leg across his opponent's support leg while pulling his arm in the opposite direction. The bald man lost control instantly. He was much heavier than Jaden, but that weight became his fatal weakness. Losing balance, he couldn't adjust in time, and his body was slammed to the ground with a heavy fall. A loud thud echoed, so strong that a few people in the nearby park turned to look. He groaned, gasping for air as the force of the takedown knocked the wind out of him. Jaden held his stance, showing no sign of arrogance or weakness. He stood tall, eyes fixed on his opponent, waiting to see what he would do next. The skinny biker staggered to his feet, wincing in pain, while the broad-shouldered man was still clutching his side from Jaden's kick. Both of them looked toward the bald man, who was still sprawled on the ground, their eyes full of surprise and confusion. They couldn't believe that a 15-year-old kid had just taken down their leader with a perfect takedown. The three bikers had thought that this would be an easy threat, a game with a schoolboy, a show of strength. But now they realized they had been wrong. Very wrong. Jaden was not an ordinary schoolboy. He had been trained, he knew how to fight. And most importantly, he was not afraid. The bald man lay on the ground for a few seconds, breathing heavily to regain his normal heartbeat. He pressed one hand to the ground, slowly pushing himself up, each movement slower and heavier than before. But one thing was clear, he was no longer as confident as he had been at the beginning. Jaden watched him rise cautiously, his hand still on the knee that had been struck, a sign that the pain was still there. He stared at Jaden, eyes darkening, but this time there was no arrogance, no empty challenge, only caution. Jaden knew he was weighing his options. He could keep fighting, but doing so would risk more injury, or he could back off, save face for himself and his buddies, and find another way to retaliate. Jaden could see the conflict in his eyes, and in his heart, he already knew the answer. Jaden didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes. If they wanted to continue, he was ready. If they wanted to retreat, he wouldn't stop them. But one thing was clear, he would not back down. The skinny biker looked at the bald man, then shook his head. He knew the fight was over. The broad-shouldered man didn't want to continue either. And finally, the bald man sighed, squinting at Jaden one last time, then gave a slight nod toward his companions. "Let's go." The three men backed off, grabbed their helmets, and silently headed back toward their parked motorcycles. But before getting on, the bald man turned back, his gaze promising something unfinished. "I'll remember you, kid." Then he revved his engine, leading the group of bikers out of the park, leaving Jaden standing there, breath steady, eyes still sharp, but deep down, he knew. This wasn't over. The sound of engines gradually faded, blending into the stillness of the park as the motorcycles departed, but the tense atmosphere lingered. Jaden stood still, his gaze still fixed on the fading figures down the paved road, where the bikers had just revved their engines and sped away. Although their sound had disappeared, the echo of the encounter was like an undercurrent that had yet to settle. He kept his breathing steady, allowing his body to relax after the tense moments, but without losing his vigilance. Jordan's fingers were still tightly gripping his brother's shirt, his breath still hurried, his wide eyes filled with concern. Jaden could feel the tremor in every small movement of his younger brother, a feeling completely different from his own, who had just gone through the confrontation without showing a hint of fear. But Jaden knew Jordan had never witnessed something like this before. The boy was still too young to fully grasp what had just happened, but enough to realize that something very dangerous had unfolded before him. And that was when Jaden sensed the change around them. At first, he only noticed a few fleeting glances, but then, as he turned around, the sight before him made him stop. A small crowd had gathered in a semicircle behind him, people who had been calmly enjoying a peaceful afternoon, now standing silently, observing him. Faces were confused, stunned, curious, and some even kept their positions mid-movement, as though they had been interrupted in the middle of a conversation. Murmurs began to rise, questions suppressed in hurried exchanged glances. Some kids were still wide-eyed, looking as if they'd just witnessed a superhero step out of an action movie. A few parents seemed worried, their eyes scanning Jaden before quickly turning to their children, ensuring they were safe. And in a corner, some people had already pulled out their phones, screens lighting up, reflecting the fading sunset. Jaden didn't need to look long to know what they were doing. Hands gripping phones tightly, cameras pointed directly at him, and the empty ground where the fight had just ended. Videos were being recorded, images being shared, and probably within minutes everything that had happened here would be on social media platforms, circulating through messages and discussions. It was no longer just a personal confrontation between him and the bikers. Now, everything had spiraled out of control. He turned to look back at the direction the bikers had left, and then he realized something more important than anything else. They had noticed this too. From the moment the bald man was thrown to the ground, from the instant their mocking laughter was replaced with heavy breathing, they had lost their advantage. A predator never wants to be seen in a defeated position, and for people like them, failure in public wasn't just a loss, it was a humiliation. The bald man didn't need to speak, but Jaden knew he felt the weight of all those eyes on him, knowing that not only Jaden but everyone present had witnessed his downfall. That was what stopped him from rushing in again. That was what made him choose to retreat. Not because he couldn't continue, but because he knew that the longer it dragged on, the weaker he would become. But that didn't mean he had given up. The last look he threw at Jaden before getting on his bike was filled with coldness, a silent promise that needed no words. "I'll remember you, kid." 4 short words, but a warning clearer than anything. Jaden wasn't under any illusion that it was over. A guy like the bald man would never forget such a humiliation, and he certainly wasn't the type to let a debt go unpaid. The sound of the motorcycle engines finally faded into complete silence, leaving an eerie quiet that enveloped the park. No one spoke immediately, but the gazes were still there, phones still raised, questions still waiting for a reasonable explanation. Jordan stood close to Jaden, his small hand still gripping his brother's arm, not out of fear for himself, but because he was worried about Jaden. "Are you hurt?" Jordan's voice was soft, worried, but also full of doubt, as though he still couldn't fully believe what had just happened. Jaden looked at his younger brother, his gaze softening. He placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze as reassurance. He didn't want his brother to worry, didn't want Jordan to think that this could continue. "I'm fine," he said, his tone calm as though he had just gone through a normal class, not a real battle. "It's over." But deep down, Jaden knew that wasn't entirely true. This was only the beginning. The videos were being uploaded, the rumors were spreading, and above all, the bikers wouldn't easily forget today's humiliation. This wasn't just a fight, it was a statement. A statement Jaden wasn't sure he should have made, but it was already etched in time. A middle-aged man, dignified in appearance, took a step forward, his gaze not filled with the fear others had, but with understanding. He gave a small nod, as if acknowledging what had just occurred. "Do you need any help?" Jaden looked at him for a moment, then shook his head. "I'm fine." The man was silent, but his eyes spoke volumes, as if he understood exactly what Jaden was thinking. A second later, he nodded again and turned to leave. Others began to disperse as well, but Jaden knew that what they had just seen wouldn't be easily forgotten. He hadn't just beaten a group of bikers. He had left a mark, and such a mark, whether good or bad, always comes with a price. Jaden gently squeezed Jordan's hand, his gaze turning somber. "Let's go, kid." Jordan didn't say anything, just nodded and followed his brother's footsteps. But deep down, both of them knew this wasn't the end. The silhouette of the biker group had completely vanished down the paved road, but what they left behind was not an empty void, but a tense silence, a heavy feeling, as if the air still carried the faint warmth from the engines of the motorcycles that had just left. Jaden stood still, his body no longer in a state of readiness for a fight, but his eyes remained sharp like a sword not yet sheathed. All of his senses were still on alert because he knew they might have left, but this story wasn't going to end so simply. Jaden stared down the quiet road where the bikers had just disappeared, and in his mind the final words of the bald man echoed like a grim declaration. "This isn't over, kid." It wasn't a spontaneous threat, not the angry, meaningless words that the defeated often utter when they leave. This wasn't a momentary threat, it was a promise, a firm statement that this would continue. The bald man wasn't the type to easily accept defeat, especially when he had been not only physically beaten, but also humiliated in front of a crowd. And Jaden knew people like him would never let such humiliation go unanswered. Jaden took a deep breath, slowly letting his heartbeat return to normal, then turned to Jordan, who was still standing silently beside him, eyes filled with worry and fear. The boy probably didn't fully understand everything, but with the instinct of a child, Jordan knew that what had just happened wasn't just a simple scuffle. "Let's go, kid," Jaden said softly, his hand resting firmly on Jordan's shoulder, but not so firmly as to make him more frightened. Jordan nodded, his eyes still showing confusion as he looked at his older brother. The boy had never seen Jaden like this. Not just the way he fought, but how he faced danger without fear, how he controlled the situation with the calmness of a true soldier. The two brothers walked away from the park, but Jaden could still feel the eyes following him from behind. People hadn't fully gone back to what they were doing before. Some remained in place, others whispered amongst themselves, and a few pairs of eyes, perhaps those who had filmed the incident, still gleamed with astonishment. Jaden didn't pay attention to any of it. He cared only about one thing. The bikers had gone, but they wouldn't stop here. The darkness had begun to fall as the two brothers walked along the gravel road leading to their neighborhood. The streetlights flickered on, casting a pale yellow glow onto the road. Normally, this was the time when Jaden felt the most at peace. The moment between day and night, when everything slowed down, and he could enjoy a bit of peace before reaching home. But tonight, that peace was gone. Jordan walked closely beside him, quieter than usual. Normally, the boy would be chattering about the football game, how he almost scored a goal, or the exciting plays. But tonight he said nothing. Jaden knew Jordan was still scared. "Jordan," Jaden spoke first, keeping his voice calm but warm enough to reassure his younger brother. "I'm really okay. No one can hurt me." Jordan swallowed, hesitated, then spoke. "But they'll come back, right?" Jaden slowed his pace, then stopped completely. He turned to face his brother, leaning down slightly so he could look Jordan in the eye. "Maybe," He didn't lie because he knew Jordan wasn't the type of kid to be fooled by empty reassurances. But if that happens, I'll face it, just like I did today. Jordan bit his lower lip, his eyes full of concern. But what if there are more of them next time? Jaden sighed softly, then placed both hands on Jordan's shoulders, holding him firmly, not to scare him, but to let him feel the protection that his older brother always had for him. When something happens, the most important thing is that you stay calm, Jaden said, his voice low but steady. I'll always be there, but if I'm not, you need to find a way to get out, find an adult, and never face it alone. Jordan nodded, but Jaden knew the boy still wasn't fully reassured. He was only 10, and this was probably the first time he truly saw the world as something more than football games or the fairy tales their mother told before bed. This was the first time he realized that out there, some people weren't just good or bad. They could be dangerous in ways he'd never imagined. Jaden gave Jordan's shoulder another gentle squeeze, then let go. All right, let's get home before Mom calls. The two brothers continued walking, this time a bit faster, because both of them knew that when they reached home, things wouldn't be as simple as before. As Jaden and Jordan disappeared around the corner, not far off in a dark alley, a motorcycle was parked quietly, its headlights off. In the dim glow of the streetlights, the bald man sat on the bike, his eyes still fixed on the park where everything had just happened. He didn't say anything, just silently reached into his leather jacket pocket, pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a long drag. The smoke drifted into the cool evening air, but his gaze remained unchanged, still sharp, still calculating. He exhaled slowly, then pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low, not hurried, but full of meaning. "That kid's not an easy one. I want to know who he is." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a hoarse voice responded, "Leave it to me." The bald man smirked faintly, a smile that held no trace of amusement. He dropped the cigarette to the ground, ground it out with the toe of his boot, then turned the bike around and sped off into the night. For him, the game was just beginning. The darkness had covered Fairfield as brothers Jaden and Jordan walked down the quiet road leading home. The streetlights cast a soft yellow glow, stretching their shadows across the concrete. The air was still, only the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty street. But despite the silence that enveloped the space, Jordan's mind kept racing with unanswered questions. The boy still felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened, from when Jaden faced off with the bikers to when he took each one down without hesitation. That scene was still vivid in Jordan's mind, like a slow-motion movie. Every movement, every dodge, every perfectly timed counterattack. Jordan quickened his pace, walking parallel to Jaden, then turned to look at his older brother with wide eyes. "How did you do that?" His voice was still tinged with astonishment and curiosity. "I mean, they were bigger than you, stronger than you, but you still beat them. You didn't even look scared." Jaden continued walking without answering immediately. He let Jordan's words hang in the air for a moment, as if he too was pondering the question. Finally, he spoke slowly, his voice deep but steady. "It's not about strength, Jordan." Jaden turned to look at his younger brother, his eyes calm but deep. "It's about discipline." Jordan frowned slightly. He didn't quite understand. "What do you mean?" Jaden exhaled deeply and then looked straight ahead. "Strength can help you win a fight, but discipline is what helps you win a real battle. If you only rely on muscle, you might win once or twice, but if you lose control, if you act without thinking, you'll make mistakes." And in a situation like today, a small mistake can make everything worse. Jordan stayed silent for a few seconds, his eyes reflecting thought. Then he swallowed, his voice softening. But what if they come back? Jaden stopped walking. He turned to face his brother, placing his hands lightly on Jordan's shoulders. His expression was more serious than ever before. If they come back, I'll face them. He spoke slowly, each word clear and deliberate, as though carving it into Jordan's mind. But remember, violence is always the last option. Jordan swallowed hard. He understood his brother's point, but the worry still lingered. But what if next time there's not just 3 of them? What if they bring a bigger group? What if they have weapons? What if they're not just trying to scare us anymore? Jaden gazed deeply into his brother's eyes, and for the first time, there was a slight hesitation. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he didn't want to say what Jordan was beginning to realize. The bikers wouldn't let go of this grudge so easily. He took a deep breath and gave Jordan's shoulders a gentle squeeze. Then I won't be fighting alone. Jordan blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Jaden tilted his head, his voice softening a little. There are times when fighting isn't the best solution. Sometimes we need to be smarter. If they come back with more people with weapons, I won't be alone. There are others I can rely on. Jordan furrowed his brow for a moment. Then his eyes lit up. Dad. Jaden nodded slightly. And the police, Jordan continued, his voice more certain now. And other adults. Exactly. Jaden gave his brother's shoulders another light squeeze before letting go. Fighting isn't just about hitting and dodging. It's also about knowing when to confront, when to back down, and when to ask for help. We never have to fight alone. Jordan nodded, looking like he understood, but there was still something in his eyes that made Jaden know his younger brother wasn't entirely at ease. But what if they hurt you? Jordan asked quietly, his voice trembling a little. You beat them today, but what if they come back next time and... Jaden cut him off with a small smile. I won't let that happen. Jordan stared at his brother for a long moment, then nodded slightly. He was still worried, but at least he knew his brother wasn't afraid. Jaden turned and continued walking, and this time, Jordan didn't hold on to his brother's jacket. The boy walked beside Jaden, his steps firmer than before. Maybe he was still scared inside, but at least he knew he wasn't alone. But as the brothers turned onto the small street leading home, Jaden still couldn't shake the heavy feeling in his chest. He knew Jordan was right. The bikers wouldn't let this go easily. And he also knew that no matter how prepared he was, there would always be situations beyond his control. They could come back at any time. And when that happened, Jaden needed to be ready more than ever. Jaden and Jordan walked quickly down the quiet street, where the streetlights cast a faint yellow glow on the cobblestone pavement. The night breeze blew gently, carrying the fresh scent of trees and a hint of coolness from the late spring evening. The atmosphere in Fairfield was usually pleasant at this time, but for Jaden, the feeling in his chest still weighed heavy. What had happened at the park was still on his mind, especially the last look from the bald guy. A look from someone who refused to accept defeat and would find a way to take revenge. Jaden slowed his pace when he saw the small house ahead, the living room light still on, and through the window he could make out the familiar silhouette of his mother. As soon as Jaden and Jordan stepped onto the porch, the front door opened, and their mother, Monica Carter, stood there, arms crossed over her chest, her face filled with concern. Mom had always been calm, but Jaden could immediately tell that she had been waiting for them for a while, and clearly more worried than usual. She wasn't the type to panic easily. She was a strong woman, accustomed to challenges and difficulties, raising 2 kids on her own while her husband was away on duty. But even someone as resilient as his mother couldn't hide the tension when she saw her sons come home later than usual. Jordan seemed a little hesitant as he entered the house, as if sensing the storm about to come. He walked past their mother, but she gently placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze quickly scanning Jordan to make sure he wasn't hurt. Then she turned to Jaden, her eyes sharper, full of scrutiny. "Where have you been?" Her voice wasn't loud or angry, but there was a seriousness that Jaden knew couldn't be avoided. Jaden took a deep breath, preparing to answer truthfully. He never lied to his mother, especially about important matters. He could already predict her reaction, a mixture of pride, concern, and perhaps anger for putting himself in a dangerous situation. "Mom," Jaden began, his voice low but steady. "We ran into some trouble at the park." His mother frowned slightly. "Trouble?" Jaden nodded and started telling the story in detail, from the moment he was waiting for Jordan, the appearance of the biker gang, to how they approached and provoked him. He didn't hide anything, including how he read the situation, kept calm, and ultimately had to fight when there was no other choice. He also mentioned the people who filmed it, and how the bikers left, but not without leaving a threat. Throughout the story, his mother didn't interrupt. She just stood there, listening with an increasingly tense expression. Jaden could see her fingers clenching at her sides, as though trying to contain her emotions. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Jordan looked from their mother to Jaden, as if waiting for her reaction. Finally, their mother spoke, but instead of scolding them like Jordan might have expected, her voice was soft and filled with emotion. "Do you realize how risky what you did was?" Jaden nodded. "Yes, I do." She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, then slowly exhaled, as if trying to control the emotions rising within her. "You did the right thing protecting your brother," she said, her tone softer, though still full of authority. "I'm proud of you for staying calm, for knowing how to handle the situation. But Jaden, that doesn't mean you should put yourself in danger." Jaden didn't argue. He knew she was right. He had done what needed to be done, but that didn't mean he should overlook what had happened. "You can't take risks unless it's absolutely necessary," she said more seriously, her eyes locking onto his. "I don't want the day to come when you leave this house and never come back." Jaden could feel the genuine worry in her voice. This wasn't just a reminder, but the fear of a mother who had seen too much loss. His father was a Navy SEAL captain, and his mother had lived through many long days not knowing whether he would return. She was used to worrying about a man in the family, but she didn't want to have to worry about her son in the same way. Jaden looked into his mother's eyes and nodded resolutely. "I promise." She looked at him for a long moment, then finally relaxed her shoulders, though her gaze still didn't seem fully reassured. She stepped closer to Jaden, gently placing a hand on his cheek, a gesture she used to do when he was little. "You're just like your father," she whispered. "But never forget you're also my son, and I don't want to lose you." Jaden smiled faintly, placing his hand over hers. "I won't let that happen, Mom." She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded, as if temporarily accepting his promise. "Go to bed," she said, her voice softening. "Both of you. We'll talk more tomorrow." Jordan, who had been silent throughout the conversation, immediately nodded and ran up the stairs to his room. He was probably exhausted after a long day. Jaden turned to go as well, but before he could step onto the stairs, his mother added one last thing. "If this isn't over, Jaden, you need to tell me. He paused, then turned back to look at her. He knew that, true to his nature, he often tried to solve problems on his own, but this time he couldn't be sure he could handle it by himself. "I'll tell you," he replied, then continued up the stairs, his mind still heavy with thoughts. Because even though he had promised, he knew a part of him wasn't ready to share everything with his mother. And he also knew that no matter how prepared he was, the real storm hadn't come yet. The room was immersed in darkness, with only the faint light from a small bedside lamp casting a warm yet lonely glow on the wall. Jaden lay on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but his mind was still spinning with a whirlwind of thoughts. The ticking of the alarm clock on the table echoed steadily, as if counting the beats of the unanswered questions swirling in his head. He wasn't afraid, but he felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders more than ever. His father's words echoed in his mind, as if he were standing right next to him, his deep yet steady voice filling the room. Victory is not always about defeating the enemy. Sometimes victory is knowing when to retreat, when to advance, and when to stand your ground. Jaden remembered the training sessions with his father when he had time to be home, those times when his father had him stand in a defensive position for hours, not attacking, not moving, just learning to endure pressure without losing control. His father had said that a true warrior never lets emotions control their actions. But tonight, Jaden wasn't sure if he had control over everything. He had fought for himself, for his little brother, for what was right, but he also knew the consequences of challenging someone like the bald guy. A guy like him wouldn't let this slide. He had been humiliated, and people like him never forget that. Jaden closed his eyes, the image of the bald guy vividly appearing in his mind. His eyes full of hatred, his clenched fist, the cold, low voice as he said, "I'll remember you, kid." A threat that needed no explanation, no further words. Jaden had no doubt about it. He would come back. He clenched his fist slightly, feeling his heart beat slowly but strongly. Not out of fear, but because he understood that next time, things might not go the same as today. He didn't just have himself to protect. He had his mom. He had Jordan. He had those around him, people who might unknowingly get caught in the crossfire if the bikers decided to target more than just him. This was no longer just a scuffle in the park. This was a war he didn't know when would erupt, but he was sure it would come. Jaden sighed, turned to look out the window. The city outside was still lost in peaceful slumber, streetlights casting their glow on the empty sidewalks. Peaceful, but temporary. He needed to prepare. Not just physically, but mentally. He needed to be ready for whatever was coming. But the biggest question still remained. Would he face it alone, or would he seek help? He knew his father would advise him not to carry the burden by himself, but Jaden wasn't sure if he could pull his mom into this. She had too many things to worry about already. His dad was on a mission somewhere far away, unable to come home immediately. And Jordan? Jordan was only 10. The boy couldn't possibly understand everything that was happening, let alone join a fight that he wasn't ready for. Jaden felt like he was standing on a thin wire, trying to balance between two choices: face it alone or find a way to protect the people he cared about without putting them at risk. He took a deep breath, then slowly exhaled, relaxing his body. There was no answer at this moment. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just sit and wait. He needed to be proactive. And the first thing he would do tomorrow was find out about those bikers. Jaden didn't know who they were, but he knew one thing. A real battle was never fought just with muscles, but with information, with intellect, with strategy. He wouldn't sit still and wait to be attacked. He would find them first. He opened his eyes, his gaze no longer burdened as before. Whatever was coming, he wouldn't back down. The night breeze swept through the quiet streets of Fairfield, carrying with it the chill from the deep alleys, where the thick darkness covered the hidden corners the streetlights couldn't reach. A sleek, black motorcycle sped through the silent streets, the engine roaring, then gradually fading as it slid into a narrow alley, where only faint lights from a small bar, closed early, cast dim glows. The bald man slammed on the brakes, the rear wheel screeching harshly against the pavement, leaving a smoky burn mark in the night. He kicked down the stand and got off the bike with angry movements, his fingers still tightly gripping the leather gloves, the knuckles white as bone. He couldn't believe what had happened tonight. He, a seasoned man on the streets for years, had been defeated by some kid in front of a crowd, brought down in a way he couldn't accept. The shame surged within him like a flood, an anger smoldering deep inside that he couldn't extinguish. "I won't let this go," he hissed through clenched teeth, his cold, merciless eyes flashing in the darkness. He walked towards the corner where a few other bikers were already waiting, their figures familiar with violence. These weren't ordinary punks. They were hardened by brutal street clashes, men unafraid to get their hands dirty to get what they wanted. A tall guy with a scar running from his forehead to his cheek leaned against the wall, holding a half-burnt cigarette. He glanced up at the bald man, then smirked. "You look like someone just kicked your ass." The bald man whipped around, his eyes flashing with fury, but he didn't speak immediately. He knew that any of them here could become an enemy if he showed too much weakness. But he also knew that to regain his honor, he needed allies. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a deep drag, letting the smoke fill his lungs, trying to calm the boiling rage coursing through his veins. "A damn kid!" His voice was deep, hoarse, filled with hatred. "A damn kid made me lose face." The biker group paused for a moment, then laughter broke out. A guy with black hair and a skull tattoo on his neck laughed loudly, as if he'd just heard an unbelievable joke. "Are you kidding me? A kid? A kid did this to you?" The bald man clenched his fists but didn't react. He didn't need a debate, he needed action. "That kid's not normal," he said, his voice dropping, his eyes darkening. "He knows how to fight. He doesn't just throw punches, he reads movements, calculates every strike. That's not something a high school kid learns on the streets." A brief silence enveloped the group, as if everyone had just realized the gravity of the situation. The scarred man was the first to break the silence. He stubbed out his cigarette on the wall, then slowly nodded. "Sounds interesting." The bald man looked around, his eyes scanning each person in front of him. "I don't need a fight right now. I need to know who he is. I want to know where he's from, who taught him that stuff, and if there's anyone backing him up." He paused, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. "And when I have enough information, I'll end him in a way he'll never forget." The man with the skull tattoo whistled softly, but this time there was no mockery in his tone. "You really want to deal with this kid?" The bald man clenched his jaw, his eyes cold as ice. "Not just deal with him. I want him to understand that he should never dare challenge me again." The scarred man smirked, a knowing grin spreading across his face. "Then we've got work to do." Far off, the city still lay asleep under the night, but in the dark alley, where hunters were plotting, something darker was beginning to take shape. Jaden may have won today, but that victory was only the beginning of a real war. The bikers didn't forget. They didn't forgive, and next time, they wouldn't just come with their fists. The sky slowly brightens, the first rays of sunlight sneaking through the window, casting a thin layer of light onto the ceiling. Jaden opens his eyes, feeling the warmth of the morning gently touch his face. But inside, that light isn't enough to chase away the lingering thoughts from the night before. He hadn't slept deeply, despite his tired body. Too many thoughts kept spinning in his head, from the hateful gaze of the bald man to the way he and his gang left without showing any sign of defeat. He knew this wasn't over. He wasn't naive enough to think that one fight was enough to make people like the bikers back off. They had been humiliated, and people like that wouldn't let a 15-year-old kid humiliate them without seeking revenge. But what bothered Jaden the most wasn't them, it was himself. He had won. He had protected his brother, held his ground, but was that really enough? If he were just a little stronger, a little faster, a little more skilled, would that really make him different from people like the bald guy? His father used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about facing it even when you're scared. But Jaden realized that fear didn't just come from people like the bikers. His greatest fear was losing himself in the fight. He didn't want to be just someone who knew how to defeat others. He didn't want to become the type of person who always resorted to fists to solve problems. He wanted to understand, to master himself, to use what he learned not just to fight, but to control a situation before it turned into a real battle. Because a real battle isn't just about two sides rushing to fight. A real battle is a battle of wits, of patience, of choices. And Jaden knew he had to choose. He couldn't wait for the bikers to come back and react the way they expected. He couldn't just sit and wait for them to strike first. He needed to take the initiative. He needed to understand his enemy before they had the chance to strike. He had to find a way to stop the fight before it started. He sat up, stretched a little, and then got out of bed. Jordan was still asleep in the next room, his steady breathing echoing softly in the quiet house. Jaden knew he had to do everything to keep his brother safe, not just by protecting him, but by ensuring nothing happened to him in the first place. Down in the kitchen, Jaden saw his mom had been up early, preparing coffee as usual. She saw him, and her eyes still held some worry from last night, but she didn't say anything right away. She just poured another cup of coffee and placed it on the table across from her, as an invitation for him to sit. Jaden pulled out a chair and sat down across from his mom. A long silence stretched between them. His mom broke it first. "Do you have any plans for today?" Jaden knew she wasn't just asking about a normal day. He gently swirled the coffee cup in his hands, staring at the table for a moment before looking up. "I need to find out about those bikers." His mom didn't seem surprised, as though she had already known he would say that. She set the coffee cup down, her eyes never leaving Jaden. "And how do you plan to do that?" Jaden thought for a moment. He couldn't look for them by confronting them directly. That would be the dumbest thing he could do. But he could ask around, gather information from people around him. Fairfield wasn't a huge city, and people like those bikers couldn't stay in the shadows forever. If they were active here, someone would know. "I'll ask people who might know about them," Jaden said, his voice steady. "I can't just sit here and wait for them to make the first move." His mom looked at him for a long time, then let out a soft sigh. "Jaden, I know you want to protect yourself and the family, but you have to promise me something." He nodded, waiting. "You can't take risks for no reason. If you're looking into them, you have to do it safely. If you feel like it's more than you can handle, you need to tell me." Jaden looked into his mom's eyes and nodded slowly but surely. "I promise." She looked at him for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, as if weighing his words. She knew her son's nature. knew that once he decided to do something, he wouldn't easily back down. But she also knew Jaden wasn't a reckless kid. He thought things through, he calculated, and he knew how to control situations. She stood up, placing a hand on his shoulder before leaving the table. "Be careful, Jaden." He watched her leave, then took a sip of coffee, feeling the bitter taste touch his tongue. Outside, the sun had risen higher, but Jaden knew a storm was still approaching. He couldn't stop it, but he could be ready. Courage isn't about not knowing fear. Courage is facing it even when you're scared, and doing the right thing, even when it's the hardest. And Jaden knew he was ready. Jaden had learned an important lesson. Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about facing it even when you are. He knew that victory wasn't just about physical strength, but also about self-control, standing firm, and making the right choices in the most difficult situations. But he also realized that every battle has consequences, and a win doesn't mean the danger is over. The bikers haven't disappeared. The storm is still coming, and next time, the confrontation could be even tougher than before. But no matter what happens, Jaden wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let fear control him. Because a truly strong person isn't the one who knows how to fight, but the one who knows when to fight and when to find another way. What about you? If you were in Jaden's shoes, what would you do? Would you face them or find a way to back down? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share the video with friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future inspiring stories. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.